Hi everyone, welcome to today's workshop on resumes, CVs, and cover letters. I have 2 o'clock on my clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started as we have a lot to cover today. So as people continue to sign in, I'm seeing the attendees numbers go up. I'm going to just take a moment to start by introducing myself. My name is Amanda Dumschlanger, and I'm one of the career counselors in the Office of Intramural Training and Education within the National Institutes of Health. And I've been at the NIH in total for about 6 years, and I've been working in career services for almost 15 years. So I've had a lot of experience working with students and trainees, specifically on their job search documents. And so hopefully I'll have some good tips and anecdotes to share with you to help you as you're creating your own documents. So a few housekeeping items, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. Everybody on the call today is muted. But please feel free to send me questions throughout the presentation. I'm going to make sure to carve out some time at the end to answer as many questions as I can get to. I'm likely not going to be able to answer all, but I will do my absolute best. And so let's go ahead. Oh wait, one question's actually coming up already. And yes, you will be able to have access to the slides after the presentation, and you'll actually be able to still see the recording of this link by going to the place where you registered as well. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn off my webcam and then just go to my slides. So resumes, CVs, and cover letters are documents that are extremely important within, within your job search. And one sort of disclaimer about these documents is that there are very few rules about them in general. So there are some sort of general guidances and best practices that I'm going to try to share with you, but you're likely going to hear sort of a lot of different opinions and advice about these documents. So let's start by talking about cover letters first and foremost. So probably the main question that I get from people about cover letters is, do I really have to send a cover letter? Is it really important for me to actually list this or to include it? And unfortunately, for those of you who don't like writing it, the answer is yes. So a cover letter always goes hand in hand with your resume or your CV. The only time that I say you can kind of have a pass and not include a cover letter is if the position description specifically says no cover letters required. But any other time, you should think about always including a cover letter as a nice complement to your resume and CV. So it is definitely not a difficult document to create, though. So one page in business letter format. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what business letter format means. But the good thing is that business letter format kind of takes up a quarter of the page already, so you only have to write about 3/4 of the page. Usually you're keeping this into 3 to 4 paragraphs. And the way that I sort of recommend structuring your cover letter overall is to think about the first paragraph, answering the question, why them? This is where you're going to say kind of how you found the job. You can list the job number. And you're going to show that you've sort of done your homework and explain why you're interested in that position employer. This is also the place that you can name drop if it's appropriate to do so. If you've been doing informational interviews with people, or if somebody referred you and encouraged you to apply for the position who works at that organization, that's the time when you can reference their name. If you do that, just make sure to check in with them and make sure that it's okay. But thinking about overall, why them? Then the second and third paragraphs, you're really thinking about focusing on skill sets that are particularly relevant for the job at hand. So you're going to kind of give an example of different skills and back those up with examples that are listed on the resume that you're submitting as well. So within the second and third paragraphs, you're really thinking about explaining why you and trying to continue creating that narrative for the employer by elaborating on your qualifications. You don't necessarily need to kind of copy and paste your resume, but try to expand upon it in complete sentences. And then the fourth paragraph, the last paragraph, is the easiest. You're going to thank them for their consideration. indicate your preference for a follow-up, that you're interested in interviewing for the role, and kind of just wrap it up by concluding. So for those of you who aren't sure what business letter format looks like, this is a sample of business letter format. So usually you're putting your address, the date, the employer's name and address, and then a greeting. So this is actually taken from our OITE cover letter guide, which I'm going to make sure you have the link to in a later slide. But it kind of gives you a sample overview of how to structure the business letter format. I always think it's nice if you use sort of the same header that you have on your resume and CV and your cover letter as well. So it kind of looks like a nice complete package that you're submitting. So why do employers ask for a cover letter? So employers are really requesting a cover letter for a variety of different reasons. First and foremost, it's really to assess your written communication skills and often your English skills. So sort of like when you applied to undergrad or grad school, you were asked for a statement of purpose or a personal statement to kind of get a sense of your writing style and to kind of help create that narrative. It's very similar to that for employers and when you're applying to different jobs. So the cover letter, it helps you to expand upon your resume in ways that you're not necessarily going to be able to sort of delineate on your resume or your CV. And it helps employers to kind of get a glimpse into who you are, and also that you've done your homework, like I mentioned, and that you understand sort of the needs of the organization and how you would sort of contribute and add value as well. So one of the main questions that I also get from people that I work with is the cover letter or the resume more important? What do hiring managers, what do recruiters tend to look at first and foremost and focus on? And that's a very tough question for me to answer because I think it really depends. It depends on the hiring manager's sort of kind of style, what they tend to value. I know that when I have been in a hiring manager position, I always, for whatever reason, looked at the cover letter first, and then I would look at the resume afterwards. And so, you know, in thinking about that, I was often hiring for roles where it was going to be very writing intensive and the person was going to need to be able to really communicate clearly on paper. And I felt that the cover letter was a great way to kind of quickly assess that. So I think the importance of whether it's the cover letter or the resume and what people are going to look at first, again, sort of depends on the person's style preference and also sort of what that particular position is asking for. So either way, every single document that you submit when you're applying to roles should be really perfect, near perfect, and they should each both be able to kind of stand on their own. So other things to think about in terms of cover letters, and I tried to include some of the main questions that I have gotten through the years. So write to a person, address the cover letter to a person if at all possible. And in order to do that, you might need to do a little bit of research in order to find who that hiring manager is. So it could be, you could do that either by kind of sleuthing on the internet through LinkedIn, by talking to contacts within your network of people. If you cannot find a specific person to address the cover letter to, I know that a lot of times the hiring manager information is actually kept sometimes very secretive depending on the organization. So if you can't find a person to address it to, it is okay to just say, dear hiring manager, dear hiring committee, or to whom it may concern. Sort of generic general greeting like that is okay if you can't find that person. So thinking about cover letters overall, as I mentioned, we generally recommend that cover letters should stay on one page. So you're really going to kind of be brief, but kind of inclusive and really taking this as an opportunity to sort of sell yourself on different skill sets. I have seen academic cover letters go on more than one page. And so what I mean by an academic cover letter is if you're in the position of applying for faculty roles. I often see people, submitting very long resumes and sometimes 2-page cover letters for those types of roles. But usually for everything else, especially any sort of non-academic positions, a 1-page cover letter is really the max. That's really what you need to be submitting. Avoiding contractions and acronyms. So the only reason that we say to avoid contractions is simply because it's considered more formal when you spell things out and don't use contractions, and we really want you to use sort of the most formal, most professional, most polished version when you're compiling your job search documents. And acronyms simply because, and this is something that I'm going to talk about probably a lot throughout this presentation, is because you want to make sure that the keywords are being hit in all of your documents. And so sometimes acronyms aren't really making that match and they're not coming up as those keywords. So spelling out any acronym that you use at least once within your document is sort of a good rule of thumb to keep in mind. Absolutely, absolutely. Please have someone else read your cover letter before you hit send. Like anything, and this is true for your resume and your CV as well, these are documents that you're likely going to have looked at many, many times, and you become a little bit immune and numb to any mistakes or errors that are on it. So it's always a good idea to have another sort of detail-oriented person take a look at your documents before you hit send. So this is an example that I use a lot, that I reference a lot. But speaking of detail-oriented, I remember receiving a cover letter from somebody who wrote that they were detail-oriented and had actually misspelled detail-oriented. And so that was a pretty big oops, so that things like that are often reasons for employers to quickly weed you out. A lot of times people are receiving a large number of applications, a large number of resumes and cover letters, and so they're looking for sometimes even small mistakes to kind of make their pile go down. So think about that and make sure that you're really taking some time to have others give you some input as well. I often see trainees at the NIH submit cover letters using NIH letterhead. Generally, that's not recommended. So no matter what letterhead you're using, just make sure that it's sort of your own personal identifier. So you're using often just sort of like your name, your contact information, and not any business letterhead. And then the other question that I often get is how to include the cover letter. Should you attach it to the email? Should you copy and paste it into the body of the email? And really either option is fine. My personal recommendation, and this is what I have done when I've been applying for jobs in the past, I usually just send an email with a quick message in the body of the email that says, please find my resume and cover letter attached for your review. And the reason that I usually attach my cover letter is because I want to convert it to a PDF, and I want to make sure that the person is receiving it the way that I see it on my screen and that the spacing is sort of nicely laid out. But it's totally fine to also copy your cover letter and put it in the body of the email. So as I mentioned, we have an OITE cover letter guide, and the link on this page, on this slide, is how you can access it. But if you even just go to any search engine and type in OITE cover letter guide, it should come up. And I encourage you to take a look at that. We have a lot of different samples provided within this document. So some of the samples are maybe a postbac or a postdoc emailing about lab openings, a postdoc applying to faculty positions with a focus on research and teaching, and then a grad student applying to industry. And so this might give you some ideas and inspiration of things that you want to include in your own cover letter going forward, and just kind of gives you an overview of how to structure this document as well. So we're going to head on into, I think we wrapped up all of the information about cover letters. So now heading into CVs and resumes. And probably the biggest question is really, what is the difference between a CV and a resume. And there are a few key distinctions between these documents, but I want to note that a lot of times these words and this language is often used interchangeably. So you might need to actually question and specify which document somebody is wanting you to submit. So the purpose of a resume is usually a very targeted marketing tool. Within that, it's very succinct, very relevant for maybe the position at hand. And then it's usually pretty short. So it's about 1 to 3 pages long. Whereas conversely, a CV, the length for a CV is virtually unlimited. So I have seen some CVs for people applying for faculty positions that are like 15 to 20 pages long. You know, you're including sort of everything that you've done. It's an ongoing academic and work history. You can include every single presentation, every single publication. You know, so this is really it's a very running list of sort of all of your experiences. And the biggest distinction often between the CV and the resume at first glance is really the length. And so it depends on sort of where you are at in your career. But you know, the general rule of thumb for resumes is that it's a page for every 7 years of professional experience. But with that said, depending on where you're applying, they might be requiring you to get all of your experience onto 1 page, even if you're a mid to advanced career professional. I often see a lot of like private sector and consulting firms really only accepting sort of 1-page resumes. So, you know, think about that as you're kind of going through and creating these documents. For many positions though, depending on sort of how many years of experience, for a lot of industry positions, we have seen that they're still allowing you to submit like a 2 to 3 page resume, and they're not expecting, especially a postdoc, to have all of their experiences condensed to simply 1 page. So when in doubt, I would really, in terms of which document you should be using to apply and what the length should be, you know, I would check in with career mentors, advisors, you know, do some informational interviews and networking to kind of see what the preferred document is to submit, because it can vary. So in addition to the CVs and resumes, there's also a federal resume. And I'm not going to talk too much about federal resumes because honestly, we could probably do an entire presentation simply on federal resumes. But the one thing that I want to sort of impart today is that a federal resume is actually very different than sort of a private sector resume that you're using. And so you're most likely going to be going through USA Jobs when you're applying to federal roles. They've actually compiled some tips and handouts that you can see in this 3rd bullet point here. There's also a really good handout that I discovered from the GW Trachtenberg School of Public Policy that kind of delineates each section within a federal resume. So you might want to take a look at that 2nd bullet point. And then overall, there is another organization, it's a nonprofit organization whose main aim is to get people interested in working for and applying to positions within the federal government. So the Partnership for Public Service has a lot of different resources and tips and advice, and they have sort of a lot of, their website is chock full of information. So that could be another resource when you're thinking about if you are in a position where you're needing to create a federal resume, because it is so different than a private sector resume. It's really going to be important for you to take some time and do sort of that research and to see what needs to go into that document in particular. Usually you are going to be using USA Jobs, maybe the resume builder within USA Jobs to create your federal resume, and that can kind of help give you an idea. I would say that just generally speaking, federal resumes are usually a little bit longer than sort of the private sector resume that you're used to, and you're going into a lot more detail and providing a lot more information that you wouldn't necessarily automatically provide when you're applying to another sector. So as I mentioned when the presentation started, that there are sort of my disclaimer overall is that there are very few rules about these documents and that there's a lot of variability. And so, you know, I often have people that I work with where I do a resume critique, and these are questions that I always ask when I do a resume critique is, where are you applying? So I want to know which sector are you going to, the nonprofit, government, private, and also in what country, because that really informs the feedback and the advice that I give you about your resume. So because they can be so different depending on kind of where you're applying, whether you need to use a federal resume, whether you should actually be using a CV for academic positions, and also in what country. So a lot of the advice that I'm giving today and the tips are really focused on North America, specifically within the United States. I've been lucky enough to spend some years of my adult working life living in Europe. And so I know that resumes and CVs are very different across the globe. And so it really does matter sort of where geographically you're focusing your search. So those are questions to kind of make sure that you're asking for your network, and also that you're thinking about kind of as you're creating these documents. So for resumes and CVs in the United States, these are things that you would not include on this document. So social security number and citizenship. So those are two that you would not generally include on a private sector resume. The asterisk here is unless it's a federal resume. And so as I noted, there are a lot of different things that you would include on a federal resume that you wouldn't include on a private sector. And things like that are often sort of considered, you know, personally identifying information. And so only provide that if you're going through sort of the USA Jobs system in order to apply for positions. Other things that you don't necessarily include would be your photo, your height, weight, your birth date, your marital status, your city, country of birth, and a lot of times this like personal information. And I, at the NIH, you know, science is such a global field, and yeah, I get to work with so many different people from around the world. And so sometimes I will see all of these things on a resume. And if they're planning on applying to positions in their home country, fine, so be it, they can keep it on. But if they're applying to positions in the US, that's definitely going to stand out as kind of out of touch with what's required within the country. And also, a lot of these things are actually considered illegal questions to ask within the United States. So you don't necessarily want to sort of be providing that information first and foremost. So the other and last thing of what you don't include on a resume CV is references. And I often get people really kind of follow up and ask me questions about this and say, really, I don't include references. I have always been told that I should include references. So it's assumed that you have references, so you don't even need to say references available upon request. You know, especially when you're applying for private sector and kind of industry type positions, they're going to ask you for a list of references later on in the process. If you are applying for academic positions, they're likely going to be asking you for letters of rec instead. So usually it's a separate document in and of itself, so you don't necessarily need to devote any of your precious white space on your resume and CV to including the references. So what are some of the sections that you should or that you could have within these documents? So some sample sections that you could have on your documents are listed here. So this is definitely not an exhaustive list. The order in which they appear on your own personal resume CV could vary, and I really encourage you to to kind of play around with it and personalize it, and overall lead with what you think are your strongest attributes at this current moment. But the three main sections, and I put them in red and bold, that you absolutely have to have on your resume or CV is your contact information, your education, and some experience section. So you can have your experience section be, you can change it around. You could write teaching, mentoring experience, research experience, leadership experience. Those are all common kind of experience sections to have, but you know, some type of experience section on your resume and CV. The two sections that are pretty resume specific overall are your summary of qualifications and a skills section. So it doesn't necessarily have to be technical skills, it could just be an overall skills section. And I'm going to talk about sort of these 5 sections in more depth in the slides to come. But just to kind of give you a sense of other sections that you could include within your documents would be certifications and licensures. I often see this maybe when I'm working with postbacks who have been, you know, first aid certified or EMTs, things like that, honors and awards, professional service, maybe memberships or associations, professional associations that you're a part of, grants, presentations, publications, patents, inventions. So these are all very common sections to have within these documents. So for contact information, and the reason that I really encourage you to make sure that you're changing your resume or CV to a PDF before you're hitting send is that unfortunately I have seen people either submit or print out their resume and their name is cut off because they made their margins so small. So I actually do recommend playing with your margins and making them pretty tiny, but as long as you're converting it to a PDF when you do that. So you make sure that your name and your contact information is still visible. So you can list it in this way. You know, you just need to have either your address, your phone number, your email. For those of you who are in college or grad school and want to have sort of your current address, but also your permanent address listed, you can kind of have 2 columns inserted within your document, really whatever, in order to just make sure that they know how to get a hold of you. And this goes without saying, but I'm going to say it just as a reminder, always check and make sure that your incoming voicemail is and your email is professional. You know, I've seen some emails listed on resumes that are a little bit questionable. You don't necessarily have to include sort of your work email address. I think as long as it's sort of your name, you know, maybe your first dot last name at whatever, making sure that it's just, you know, standardized. Okay, so usually after contact information, the next section that comes up is often education. So unless you have a qualification summary, but usually this is how you would structure your education section. So there are a few things that you have to have listed for each experience. So you need to list the location for each and every school. So you're usually saying the school's name, the location, the degree that you're getting, and then your month and year of graduation. Or if you haven't graduated yet, you can say anticipated May 2020, expected May 2020, whatever that is, that's fine. And usually for education, as opposed to sort of your experience section, you're just putting the end date and not the range that you attended. One of the main questions that I get about education sections is whether or not you should include your GPA. And truthfully, if you're using your CV or resume to apply for college or apply for grad school, they're going to be getting an academic transcript. They're going to be seeing your GPA and a very detailed academic history. But you know, our general recommendation is if it's a 3.0 or higher to include it. And depending on the organization, they may actually require that you list your GPA as well. So just make sure that you're reading the job ad really thoroughly. And there's usually no reference, as you see, this person hasn't listed high school. So there's no reference to high school, usually after your sophomore year of college. So a lot of things from kind of earlier in your life tend to start falling off your resume as time goes on. Okay, now experience section, and this is really the bulk of your resume, and this is where you're going to be spending a lot of your time kind of curating this and making sure that it's well tailored for each role. So experience can include a variety of different things. So oftentimes when I'm working with people who are just starting out in their career, or are maybe still in college or even high school, and are lamenting the fact that they don't have a lot of professional experience to list, then you're going to want to think creatively about your experience. So experience can be paid positions, unpaid positions, volunteer roles. It doesn't have to be only full-time positions. It could be part-time, any leadership roles that you've participated in community service, or involvement in student organizations. So, really make sure that you're thinking about all of these things that you've done. I am a big proponent of keeping a master document for your resume. And maybe this is one that you're not going to be submitting anywhere, but it could just be sort of a running list of everything that you've participated in and giving a little bit of detail about it. I think that's really important because as time goes on and as the years go by, you do tend to forget what you did. And there could be an experience that you participated in that you're going to want to highlight for different positions at different times. So make sure that you are thinking about all of these types of experiences and keeping that on your running list. As I noted, you can label your experience different sections. So since I'm at the NIH, most of the time I see people have research experience, public health experience, teaching mentoring experience, leadership experience. If you don't feel like you are at a point in your career where there's a common thread running throughout your experience, you can also just say relevant experience and list everything that you feel like is relevant for the position where you're applying. And then everything else that's not as relevant, you can call that related experience. So you can also kind of break up your activities and your experiences. And this is a way to make sure that you're playing kind of with the format on the document and allowing what you think are the most relevant experiences to be first and foremost, kind of on that first page of the document. This is an example of how to structure the experience within a resume. So you can, as you can see, this person has listed research experience, that they're a postdoc research fellow in Bethesda, Maryland at the National Institutes of Health, and going into the National Institutes of Drug Abuse, and then the date range that they have been working. So no matter what you do, you have to have all of this information for every single experience that you list. And that can seem like a lot, but it is really important to make sure that it's clear to the reader and the reviewer of your resume to kind of match where you did each experience. So, I would say that most of the time when I'm reviewing resumes, people don't list the location, and then sometimes they actually forget to list the dates. So make sure that you include that for each experience. And then once you've given sort of that overview using your title, the organization, the location, the dates, then you're going to create bullet points for each and every experience that are sort of delineating what you have done within the role, your responsibilities, your accomplishments. And truthfully, this is one of the hardest parts of writing a resume, is writing really effective bullet points. So I'm going to go into this in even more detail, but as you can see, this person has written, I'm conducting experiments, I'm designing research project, I'm publishing, I'm presenting, I'm collaborating. They're using a lot of really great verbs to explain their experience. So each verb within your resume for your bullet points needs to start with a really strong active verb. So because there is such an importance on the verbs that you're using for bullet points, we have created within our OITE resume and CV guide a multiple page list of different action verbs that you can use. And we've actually sort of broken it down by technical skills, research skills, teaching skills, management leadership skills, organizational skills. And this list goes on and continues for a few more pages. Truthfully, this is one of my favorite pages within our OITE resume and CV guide. I think it's probably one of the most useful in sort of looking at synonyms essentially that you can use and kind of to give you some ideas. You know, I think people tend to find words that they really like and they use them over and over again. And so one of the biggest mistakes that I see on resumes as I'm reviewing them is that people are using the same verb for almost every bullet point, almost every experience. And so, you know, I really often go through and say, like, think about other ways to say this. Think about another verb that you can use. You really want to try to diversify that, and it helps kind of keep the attention of the reader, them engaged, to kind of keep going through and seeing what that experience has been like for you. When in doubt, look to the job ad for inspiration, but you can also check out this verb sheet in order to kind of have some ideas. So, creating resume bullet points. As I mentioned, I think this is one of the most difficult things to do well within a resume. So here are some general tips to keep in mind as you're writing your bullet points. So as I mentioned, you know, starting with a strong action verb, varying the verbs that you're using, and looking to the job ad for guidance. You know, you have been told your entire life, really, not to plagiarize. And, you know, you've told about academic integrity. And then when it comes to job searching, we're saying really mimic the job ad as much as you can and looking to that for keywords that you should be including. So it's a little bit of a reshift to the thinking that's sort of been ingrained. But a lot of times people use very passive and generic statements. So anytime I see responsible for or my duties included, I usually cross that out and, you know, really want you to make it much more action oriented. And when you're thinking about that, this PAR framework can be really helpful. So the PAR framework, it's also can be referred to as the STAR framework. Actually, this is a technique for behavioral interview questions. And so it's a way to kind of think about interview questions, but I actually think it's really helpful for creating bullet points too. So you're going to think about what problems did I encounter in my job? Sort of what was the situation that I encountered? Then you're thinking about what actions did I take to solve the problem? And I would really like to emphasize what I take, because I often see people speak about the actions that were taken sort of as the lab overall or from your boss or your principal investigator, but really try to focus on you. This is your document in order to market yourself and your skills. So making sure that it's really personalized in that way. And then what were the quantifiable results from those actions? So, you know, accomplishments-driven resumes are really becoming the norm. And so making sure that you are demonstrating those results to the employers. And if you can quantify it, please do so. So add in numbers whenever possible. And I recognize that that's not always easy to do. It's not everybody works in a position where they can say, I improved this process and sales increased by, you know, 23%. But do your best and figure out which numbers you can add in to sort of help add that dimension to the reader. So talking more about writing effective bullet points, what we normally see within a resume is a very generic statement like, I have excellent verbal and written communication skills. And, you know, normally even when I check in with a person and I say, would you believe that if you saw that? And they say, yeah, you're right. It's, you know, I'm not showing anything more. And so what we would actually encourage you to do, instead of just saying something so generic, is think about all of the different verbal and written communication skills that you've used, right? So maybe you can say you've presented X posters and Y talks at national and international meetings. You discussed results. You wrote SOPs, journal articles. You edited, you facilitated, you negotiated. Look to our action verb list within the OITE guide in order to kind of have a sense of the different types of verbs that you can use for communication skills. But it is really important to go into more detail and not necessarily just have a bullet point that's really vague and generic like that. So I'm mostly working with scientists, and I always say show them the data. They want to know, they want to see the data. So you need to provide that within your job search documents as well. Okay, so now we're going to move on to your qualifications summary. So at this point, you have your contact information, your education, your experience. You kind of have a sense of how to start structuring those bullet points under your experience. So summary objective statements are typically only for resumes. I very rarely see them on CVs, but I think depending on where you're at in your career, a qualification summary is a really great addition to your document, especially if you are further along in your career, because it kind of helps give them an overview of your experiences. Plus, it is the first thing that they usually see, and so it's the easiest place to kind of adjust for the job ad. So I really encourage qualification summaries. On the other hand, I often see objective statements on resumes. So an objective statement, it looks something like this: seeking a responsible position in an industry lab doing cancer research. And anytime I see an objective statement on a resume, I usually cross it off. And that sentence and that type of language is really better suited for, you're going to see that in your cover letter and not necessarily within your resume. And you should really think about expanding upon that and converting it to a qualification summary instead of just having this, again, sort of generic, not telling me a whole lot of new information objective statement. So here's an example of a qualification summary. Cancer biologist with 10 years of experience managing multiple projects in the following areas: 6 years in mouse models, 4 years in yeast, supervision of lab personnel, management of lab budget. So this person is doing a lot of great things here. I am a big fan of qualification summaries that have sort of a general overview. It's like a sentence primer introduction to you, and giving years of experience, quantifying that when you can, and then going into more detail about sort of the key skills or key qualifications. And these are the areas that you can really vary and you should edit according to the position that you're applying to. So the one thing that I think this person needs to be doing better in their qualification summary is they could quantify more. So they could say how many lab personnel they supervise. What are the distinctions? Is it, summer interns, postdocs, whatever. You can go into a little bit more detail. Management of lab budget, if you're allowed to kind of share those numbers and that detail, it would be nice to know if it's a budget of 5,000 or, way more than that. So, that kind of helps to give the reader a little bit better sense of where you're coming from. But overall, qualification summaries are a great introduction and a really nice thing to have on your resume as you move forward in your career. So as I have noted, we also have an OITE resume and CV guide, and we have a lot of different resume samples listed within this document as well. So this is an example of a summary of qualifications. So this is a postdoc applying to industry. And so you can kind of go through here and see some of the different samples that are listed, and what we kind of encourage overall. But this is, an example again of a qualification summary. Okay, the last section about resumes that we're going to touch on today is the skills section. And the skills section is often sort of the very last section on a resume. So I often see CVs structured in sort of education, experience, grants, awards, presentations, publications. I often see publications as sort of the last section on the CV because it tends to be a long and ever-growing list. For resumes, I think the skills section is sort of the nice kind of wrap up of your experience, and kind of it's a great thing to have in mind because you should be keeping computer filters in mind. So a lot of the skills that you could potentially be listing within this section might even be sort of words that you're seeing within the job ad. So make sure that you're organizing it by section. This person chose to delineate by biochemistry, cell biology, microscopy, molecular biology. And depending on where you're working in the field that you're working in, you might even think about organizing it by lab skills, computer skills, software skills, language skills. And for some of these things, you might need to also note your proficiency level. So, you know, there, especially for language skills, and if you're applying for a position where, you know, French is required, and you feel like you have intermediate working proficiency for French, but not sort of native or full proficiency, you're definitely going to want to delineate that. Same thing for any sort of like programming or softwaring, making sure that you're kind of qualifying those and being really honest and authentic about what that skill level might be. For the languages, if you need help having an idea of where your proficiency level is, the US State Department website actually has a pretty good like quiz and guide to kind of help you assess what your skill level is for different languages. But these are, you know, overall great things to kind of keep in mind in terms of that last section. Overall, when you're thinking about creating these job search documents, you know, sometimes I often get asked, what is sort of my best advice when creating job search documents and resumes? And I would say that, you know, one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make is just being modest in these documents. And they're not necessarily taking ownership of the need to kind of market themselves effectively. So making sure that you're promoting your skills in sort of a very authentic, but, you know, a way that's going to be really helpful and relevant for the employer. And when in doubt, you know, what search committees are looking for, you know, overall, when they're reviewing your documents, they are looking for sort of that track record of excellence. So that you have experience in research, training, or patient care, or that you have participated in professional development and trainings that are helping you to get to that level. I often talk to recruiters, and I always hear them say that they want somebody with strong analytical skills, communication skills, and leadership, or the ability to work well on a diverse team. And if you've ever worked in a lab, you have been exposed to all of those skills, and you would hopefully have examples to kind of provide about each of those skill sets. Other things that I often hear are sort of strong teaching and mentoring skills. And then the last one is, you know, really kind of a hard thing to measure, but a good fit with the needs of the department. And so a lot of times that fit comes out within the interview, but also you can kind of ascertain that by doing informational interviews and networking ahead of time. And, you know, make their lives easier. So, you know, making sure that you're submitting documents that are well suited, whether it's a CV, resume, cover letter, and that are really tailored to the job ad. The other biggest mistake that I see people make within their job search overall is really not tailoring their documents and thinking that sending a generic resume and a generic CV and a cover letter where you tweak one or two words for, you know, the organization is going to be sufficient. And I have met with people who have, you know, been really frustrated and have come back and said, I've submitted 300 applications and I haven't heard anything. And then I quickly realized it's because they haven't been tailoring 300 different applications. You know, so I would much rather you send 30 really well tailored, you know, really highly curated for the position at hand, in order to make it kind of as easy on the recruiter and the hiring manager to see how you're a fit for the role. So as you're thinking about marketing yourself, and that's essentially what you're doing within all of these documents, these are some questions to ask yourself. These are actually listed in the resume guide as well. I would say that most people ask themselves sort of, what were my job responsibilities? And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So you really should be thinking about, what were my accomplishments? What skills did I develop? How can I quantify those results? You know, other things to think about: what decisions did I make? Did I work with people? How did I communicate? Was I in a leadership role? How did I overall make a difference in the position? And those are all intended to kind of give you some time to be introspective and reflective about the experience and how you're going to be able to market that within these documents and also eventually within an interview going forward. Okay, so we're nearing the end of our section on resumes and CVs. I'm going to give you some final tips and then I'm going to see what questions you have for me. So some general resume do's and don'ts. Let's start with the do's. So formatting is absolutely key, especially for resumes. So use all of the options available to you. Use bold, italics. Sometimes you'll hear the 20-second rule, or sometimes it's like the 20 to 60-second rule. And that's the average amount of time a person spends reviewing your resume the first time around. So like I mentioned, oftentimes they're looking for reasons to say no and just move their pile out. So making sure that your resume is clean, neat, easy to read, very, very skimmable. And what helps with that is just being consistent. So even though there are very few rules about documents, one of the major recommendations is to be consistent and structure all of your sections the same. So, you know, if you choose whatever font you choose, make sure that you use that throughout. I've seen resumes where it was like no font was left untouched, right? Like they just used everything. Generally don't recommend that. You know, the sizing too, your font size on your resume should be between 10 to 14. Whatever you do, don't go below 10. It becomes really, really hard to read after that. So you can make your name, you know, and your headers bigger than that size. Like you could make your name 20 and you could make your headers 15. But generally sort of for the information that you're listing within each section, 10 to 14 is ideal. As I noted, make sure you're listing dates and locations for all your activities and experiences. And then you're going to be listing all of your experiences in reverse chronological order. So that means that you're going to have the most recent experiences listed first, depending on each section. I have seen some CVs in chronological order, but even for a CV, I think reverse chronological order is best. Okay, now some don'ts. So don't get too fancy and stand out for the wrong reasons. You know, I always think of, you know, a few people who had submitted applications when I was in a hiring manager position, and you know, sometimes you're clearly trying to stand out from the pile and maybe putting in like too fancy a font or making their name vertical or doing something else that's a little bit kind of quirky or unique. You know, again, make it easy for them to skim and try not to stand out for the wrong reasons of either annoying them for not having your information presented in a clear and concise way. I would say that this is also why I encourage you not to use templates, because templates create really weird spacing on documents a lot of the time. So when I see resumes that were created in a template, I usually immediately know that they were created in a template because there can be weird columns and spacing. So my best advice is to look at sort of inspiration from samples and then create your own blank Microsoft document and then go and format it how you see fit. Don't use any personal pronouns. This seems a little bit silly, but within all of these, within your resume and CV rather, you speak in the third person. You can use personal pronouns in cover letters, but in resumes you don't. And then lastly, and most importantly, don't lie on your resume. We see lots of, I mean, there are lots of headlines that I could pull up about people who have been found out for lying on their resume and then they were fired. But I would say even thinking about your proficiency levels, you know, making sure that you're pretty accurate in that. I hear a lot of, from a lot of trainees that that's being assessed and tested within the interview. So your proficiency level within a program or software, that could be tested. So make sure that you're not, you know, overinflating your level. I do think you want to present sort of like the most polished professional version of yourself, but it should really be authentic. So final resume tips, real estate matters. Make sure that you're putting the most important things. sort of at the front and leading with that. That's why I'm such a big fan of a qualification summary. You know, double and triple check for typos. Word spell check doesn't catch everything. I've seen a lot of really unfortunate typos during my reviews. So always having another set of eyes can be really helpful. So asking faculty, mentors, colleagues. Remember though that you're going to hear a lot of different opinions. And a lot of this is going to be very dependent on the person's field, background, sort of what they have been accustomed to. So the best opinions to really focus on are from insiders with a lot of experience. So maybe somebody who has just recently gone on the job search and successfully managed getting a position that you think is an aspirational position for you. And always tailor your resume for each job posting. It's a lot of work. I totally get that it's very time consuming, but remembering your audience as you're going through and kind of crafting these documents is going to make it a whole lot less painful for you. So thinking about that and tailoring your resume for each application, I would be remiss to not talk about sort of the applicant tracking systems that are used by so many different organizations now. So I mentioned keywords sort of ad nauseum throughout this presentation today. So making sure that you're using the right keywords for each application. Here are two resources that could be helpful for you. So the first one is actually just kind of fun. It's Wordle, and you can go to the site and you can actually copy and paste your resume or your cover letter, and it creates a word cloud of your document. So it will show you which words you're using more, and they become bigger on your document. So you kind of have a sense of what you're really highlighting within that document and how you're marketing yourself. So you can look at that word cloud to make sure that you're, covering all of things. For example, if you're applying for a position in consulting and you don't see consulting at all within your Wordle, that's maybe a problem, or clients or things like that, other vernacular that would be applicable to that field. So the other resource that is beneficial is called jobscan.co. And I don't think you need to go choose the premium membership. Maybe the basic one will be fine, but you can copy and paste the job ad and a copy of your resume, and it will do a quick scan and give you a percentage of how well you're tailoring your documents for that position. Okay, so resources, we have a lot of information online. We have a whole YouTube channel on resumes and cover letters and CVs versus resumes. This YouTube channel is growing. The number of videos is growing by the day since all of our presentations are online now. So definitely take a check and see if there's anything that's going to be kind of relevant for you and what you're hoping to learn a little bit more about. We also have a really awesome blog. I manage the blog, and so we have a lot of different resources. The blog has been in existence for over a decade now. So there is great content. You can search by keyword and kind of get a sense, but two that I would recommend are on resumes and CVs, and also identifying what are your transferable skills. Okay, so I know we had a lot to cover today. So now I'm going to kind of go through and look at the questions that are coming in. And if you have to sign off, I know we only have a few minutes left. I'm going to go over and actually just spend 5 or so minutes going through and answering as many questions as I can. But if you have to sign off, I totally understand, and thank you for joining me today. All right, so let's go through some of the questions that I see. All right, here we go. Okay. Is it appropriate to provide hyperlinks to publications? Yep, you absolutely can. Let's see. That's fine to do so. Sometimes people also list hyperlinks to like LinkedIn profiles and things like that. That's totally fine to do within your resume. Okay. Are cover letters primarily for jobs, or do you include them for med school? Nope, primarily for jobs. For med school, you're going to be asked for a personal statement. Can I list selected research experience instead of research experience? Yes, absolutely. And that's something that I think is a great tactic to do for resumes. So it's a way to kind of show that you have more things that you could be listing. I often see people do that when they need to say like selected presentations or even selected publications. Sometimes if you're applying for bench positions in industry, people will list that. So selected is a great thing to list. Can we use multiple action verbs for a bullet, i.e. developed and executed? Yes, absolutely you can. You know, sometimes I see bullet points are way too short. And so, you know, it's okay to go on more than one line for a bullet point and really make it kind of as robust as possible. So do you have a sample resume template? We have sample resumes within our OITE resume and CV guide, but again, you know, try to make your own, create a blank Word document and use them as inspiration, but I wouldn't actually recommend using any of the templates that you find online. Do you need to explain your legal situation, visa, green card? So I see a lot of people list a green card holder at the top of their resume, maybe within their qualifications summary. And if you think that your designation is going to be sort of beneficial to you, then by all means list it. But you know, the problem is if you don't have that and you're still trying to kind of get an interview, you don't necessarily need to provide any of that information. So resume critiques, cover letter critiques, CV critiques are only available. So if you're a trainee at the NIH, we do critiques for trainees within the NIH. But if you are not affiliated with the NIH, I would really encourage you to think about, you know, utilizing your career centers from your undergrad or your graduate school. A lot of times there are alumni career services available, and they can do a really nice job of giving you a critique as well. Yes, for those of you who logged in late, you are going to have copies of the PowerPoint after the session, and actually this is being recorded, so you'll have access to this video link as well. Oh, a question about font styles. Are there any preferred font styles, either New Times Roman or Arial? And you know, that's a really great question. There isn't necessarily a set list of sort of approved font styles. You know, I think as long as it's kind of clean, easy to read, and not super kind of curly or fancy, and it makes it difficult to go through, then by all means, you know, feel free to use whichever font you prefer. All right, let's see. So a question about listing membership in professional organizations. Are these worth listing on the resume? Are these worth joining? So that's a great question. I think professional organizations and membership in different professional associations can sort of highlight your commitment to a field. They're also often good ways to sort of network and attend conferences, and often they actually have sort of a career listing website of different jobs. So it's maybe not necessary to include that on your resume, and you don't need to join just to kind of have that listed on your resume, but I think there are a lot of benefits to kind of being a part of different groups overall. Okay. I've heard that you shouldn't include your address, but rather just city, state, zip. What are your thoughts? I'm open to relocating and thus don't like including my address on a cover letter. How would you handle this and why? This is a really great question. So I would say that there is a trend to not listing your full address on your resume. So I think as long as you are listing ways that they can get in touch with you with an email and a phone number, that is okay. If you are hoping to relocate and maybe applying for different positions in new areas, so you can address that in your cover letter, and that might be a good thing to say, like, I'm planning to relocate, and that's why I'm applying for positions in this area. I have also seen people sort of list sort of like their future address, or they've used a friend's address in order to kind of appear locally because they knew that they were going to be coming, and there might be a little bit of a preference for local hires. So I think there are a few different options that you can use within including an address on your documents. Okay, somebody got confused about the objective statement and the career summary. So objective statements are bad, qualification summaries are good. So really thinking about if you have an objective statement to converting it to maybe a more robust qualification summary or deleting it entirely. All right, let me see. I'm going to answer a few more questions and then I'm going to end the presentation today. Oh, good question. So how do you, if my school reported GPA on a scale other than the 4.0, should I convert the number or indicate that it's not at a 4.0? I would just indicate that it's not at a 4.0 and what the scale is that you're using. I think that's sort of okay, and you don't need to worry about kind of going through that math of figuring out what that would be. If the school is not in the US, should you include the country? For example, New York, USA. Yes, absolutely, you can include the country. That would be a great thing to do. Okay. If you've studied abroad, how would you indicate that on a resume? Usually that comes under your education section. Sometimes I see, actually the sample that I showed in the slides was a little bit indented and in italics, and that was sort of their study abroad year. But yes, absolutely, that's a great thing to list on a resume. Okay, so one more question and then I think we're done. Okay, is it better to include skills in your bullet points rather than in a separate section? Great question. So you're going to be including skills within your bullet points. And then the separate section, the separate skills section that usually comes at the end of your resume is often for very specific skills, sort of like the lab, the computer, the software, the languages. If there is a little bit of redundancy between the sections, between bullet points that you have on your resume and the skills section, that's okay. That's going to happen no matter what. And again, yes, this is going to be, all the slides are going to be available to you after the presentation at the link. So thank you all for joining me today. If I wasn't able to get to your question, I'll do my best to follow up with you after, but I appreciate your participation and enjoy the rest of your day.